Columbus episode, ranging from who was Columbus, the man, to what was his legacy. We have two interviews which we're going to intermix for you about this subject. Ward Churchill is a Native American, very active with the American Indian movement, and he's the author of several books, including Agents of Repression. Kirkpatrick Sale of the Schumacher Institute is also the author of many significant books, including Conquest of Paradise, a book about Columbus.
Ward, when I was growing up, going to school in the 40s and 50s and all, Columbus was a big hero. And, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, discovered America and all like that, and it wasn't until many years later that I discovered what really happened and the consequence to the Native American people. What do you think of this Columbus thing that's going on now?
Well, it's approximately equivalent to the Germans decided to declare a national holiday to celebrate their culture and the attainments of that culture by selecting as a signifier of those attainments Adolf Hitler or Heinrich Himmler or any of the others of the Nazi leadership. The signification is one of genocide. The symbology is one of genocide, ecocide, expropriation of native peoples in terms of their lands, their lives, their traditions, their heritage, the historical understandings of what it was they were about, continue to be about, and the negation of entire cultures, utter obliteration of a vast complex of civilizations in this hemisphere, and the replacement of those with self-proclaimed superior cultures and superior breeding stock. Essentially the same proposition as what the Nazis unleashed upon the world in the 1940s had been unleashed upon the world by Christopher Columbus, both literally and symbolically, nearly 500 years earlier. We find that not to be something to be celebrated. We find that not to be something to be taken casually.
Do you feel vindicated in your criticisms of Columbus that now even the mass media has to concede that Columbus wasn't such a nice guy?
The media really has not come to grips with that. They acknowledge accusations, they acknowledge contentions, primarily for the purpose of seeking to, in a very popular and public way, knock them down. They set up straw men in a way. And it's usually a counterbalance, so-called objective rendering of the history, what the debate is to be. Well, perhaps Columbus did this, that, and the other thing. However exaggerated the Indian claims now are, he did do certain things which lend credence to that, but on the other hand, look at all the good things which came from it, the inculcation of European civilization, the improvements that have been wrought, obvious improvements if you look around at the environment and so on. In the 500 years since, ultimately things worked out the best, even for the victims. This is undeniable in the view of the establishment media. Well, you'll excuse me for observing that precisely the same argument might be made with regard to Adolf Hitler. To return to that theme, he, after all, was responsible for the development of the Autobahn, which translates into the expressways that American motorists like to drive around on now. He was responsible for causing the creation of the Volkswagen, which provided a relatively inexpensive form of private transportation to millions of working class people who would not otherwise have had that, and they could drive them around on the Autobahns or the expressways. He was responsible for scientific innovations in genetics, various aspects of medicine, rocket telemetry, and so forth. So why should we bad rap Adolf Hitler? Why shouldn't we celebrate Adolf Hitler? Look at the good side. Why do you dwell on the negative? This is so biased and one-sided in the telling.
Well, did you discover the real Columbus in all your research?
Well, I did. It took 7 years of this research to do it. But he is there in the documents, if anybody will take the trouble to read the documents. Astonishingly, most historians haven't taken the trouble to do this, and I was amazed. I mean, I'm just an amateur historian, that is to say, operating out of love. Amat, the Latin amat, to love. And I was able to uncover things about Columbus that I hadn't seen in the professional historians' accounts anywhere. Apparently they just don't bother to do this slogging through the record. But we have for Columbus a very voluminous record, more than we do for any other explorer of this age at all, more than for almost any figure of the 15th century. He poured out his heart, and he wrote all these documents, and there were official arrangements with the king and queen, and it was all kept by the court. So from 1492 on, we know a lot about Columbus. So I was able to use all of that to get a pretty good picture of who that real Columbus is.
Well, what are some of these things that you discovered that the traditional historians did not?
Let's see. Most of what we know about Columbus is all wrong. His name wasn't Columbus. His name was Colon. The only time he ever used his name, Cristobal Colon. He didn't discover America, obviously, because there were lots of people here already. And it wasn't America. America is a word that was used and invented in 1507, the year after Columbus died. So that starts out what we don't know about him. There is also this image of Columbus as being the heroic visionary, a man who, unique among the population of Europe, had the notion of sailing westward out into the ocean sea and discovering new lands. I don't know why that persists. Well, I know why it persists, because people want to make up myths. But the fact is that the Portuguese from early in the 15th century had been sending out missions. And we know of at least 20 documented missions that the Portuguese sent out, and there are probably others that they didn't talk about, one of which went out in 1490. And they went out from the Azores, which was the Portuguese islands in the North Atlantic, and they went on the wrong winds, and so they didn't succeed. And Columbus went out from the Canaries, which was owned by the Spanish, and he had favorable winds to go out, and so he did succeed. But the idea of going out was not unique to Columbus at all. It was something that Europeans had been doing by then for nearly a century.
We know this conclusively to be true because white people, per se, had been coming back and forth across the Atlantic to the New World for some long period of time. Prior to Columbus, the Vikings had, of course, come. There's considerable evidence that the Basques had been fishing. The Basques, the Ascoti people from the northern portion of the Iberian Peninsula, had been fishing off Newfoundland and as far north and westward as into Hudson's Bay for several centuries prior to Columbus. There are Phoenician urns off the Bahama Islands suggesting that there was transatlantic trade between the Phoenicians and the peoples of the New World, none of which interaction engendered the kind of results that we're talking about with the Columbian arrival. And incidentally, there was transatlantic and trans-Pacific commerce between the peoples of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, in the New World, and of South Asia as well, in all probability, for a long time before Columbus.
So Columbus's feat doesn't quite stand out as the unique event that people want to make it. When you go and you discover more about this man, you see that he had no intention of a noble, visionary quest. It has nothing to do with science or conquering new territories or going where no one had ever gone before. None of that, none of that. All that stuff that we've poured into the vessel of Columbus in later years, it didn't exist in this man. He was going out to find treasure. Simple as that. That's all he'd ever done in his life. He was a merchant mariner. And we have records of him where he goes from Genoa to one island or to one port or another. That's what he did. And then he was trying to persuade the king and queen of Spain to send him out on a merchant mariner's voyage, a simple businessman's quest for treasure. And that's in fact, the arrangement with the king and queen exists. We have that record, it's there. And it says that we're sending him out to discover and acquire islands and mainlands in the ocean sea and bring back jewels, gold, precious spices, anything of whatever kind and measure he can find out there.
And,
straightforward.
And he was able to secure a very lucrative deal with the king and queen of Spain, that he would get a certain percentage of the goods, that he would have certain titles and certain positions over the viceroy over these new islands. And as soon as he got there, that's all he was interested in, was claiming possession of the land and then going for gold.
Going for gold. And then in later life, he wanted to make sure that he got all of these titles and all of the percentage of the riches that he thought was coming his way. And he devoted his entire life to the quest for gold and to the securing of greater and greater riches for himself and for his children. There's nothing in there that's really admirable in the way that he's been made into this heroic figure. He is quite grubby, in fact, you'd have to say, quite grubby about this quest, this eternal search for treasure for himself.
In fact, that's basically the content of his first couple of voyages, that he'd go from island to island searching for gold. If he couldn't find it, he'd leave. If he'd heard rumors of it, he would basically conquer the Indians there and even kill them if they refused to cooperate with him. So this is not very
He didn't
admirable.
kill any on the first voyage
Not on the first.
that we know of.
Right.
But he was continually searching for gold, and he says so. And he writes in his log, he says, I didn't stop at this island because I wanted to go to the other one where they told me there was a lot of gold. And he gets there and he says, I don't stop at this one, and there's so many things here that I should investigate. It's such a beautiful island, but I'm not going to stop because I'm going to go someplace where they tell me there's gold. And he's quite frank about this. There's just no doubt about what is in his heart, and it's this lust for treasure, and gold in particular.
When did the idea of enslaving the local population come up? Was that one of the first goals, or did that come up after as he said, he saw that they were so nice and so obedient and so easy to get along with and generous?
Well, he says that on the very first day or two that he confronts them, and he says that they're sweet and gentle and the kindest people in all the world, and they should make good servants. And he takes 6 of them from the very first island that he goes to and just grabs them, puts them on the ship, and he ends up taking 8 or 9 of them back to Spain, finally. But the part of enslavement really comes later, when he comes back in the following year, in 1493, with maybe 1,500 Spaniards who are going to establish a colony there. And these are kinds of Spanish nobility that have no intention of doing any work, so they want somebody else to do the work for them. And so there are all these Indians there. And the idea was that you could give these Indians, apportion them to the Spanish, and the Spanish would then use them to go out and pan and dig for gold. Columbus knows that there's gold on the island of Hispaniola, and he has seen it in the rivers, and he knows that it must be up in the mountains somewhere, flowing down. And the Spanish know that there's gold there. They don't find a big deposit of it until 1500, which is the very year that Columbus leaves that island in disgrace. But in that process of the 7 years of searching for this gold, Columbus establishes a system by which the Spanish can use slave labor of these Indians. He also tries a system by which the Indians are forced to go out and provide that gold and bring it to the Spanish, and he threatens to chop off their hands if they don't do it. And he must have made good on that, at least for some of the people, although it's in the long run, it's a self-defeating proposition if you want the Indians to bring you gold to cut off their hands. You can see that there's a limit to that. But the idea of enslaving people on the islands was fixed right from the beginning, and they did that with the Indians. But now, what happens is that the Indians die off because their society's been disrupted, and because the Europeans are introducing diseases of all kinds, 30 of which, at least we know, were introduced, which were deadly, immediately deadly. Just within weeks and months, these Indians would die from diseases to which they had no immunity. They were diseases that were known in Europe, but the Americas were virtually disease-free continents, and they didn't have any of these large-scale epidemic diseases of the kind that Europe had. So the diseases come over, and the Indians start to die off immediately. There may have been as many as 7 million or more on the island of Hispaniola alone, 7 million Indians. And we estimate this by working back from Spanish records, which we do have. And so we can see the Spanish kept records because they wanted to keep track of this labor. They wanted to know how many good people were out there, and the people were dying off, and they wanted to say, well, how many we got to divide up among all these noblemen. And we can see the track of what happened there, that by 1515, there are maybe 20,000 left
Out of
7 million people, within the space of not even a full generation. So the business of enslaving these people conflicts with the business of the diseases that kill them off. And as they die off, the Spanish go to other islands looking for more Indians, and they bring them in from Jamaica and from Puerto Rico and from Cuba and all over. But they still die off because they are just have no resistance to these diseases. Ultimately then, by about 1502, the Spanish are looking around for some other source of slave labor. Africa. Africa. They think of Africa, where the Portuguese had long had a kind of a minor trade, and they begin bringing in Africans who do have immunity to most of these diseases because of a long contact with Europeans. And they bring from starting in about 1502 or 3, the first Africans come, and that begins that awful process of the transatlantic slave trade.
I've seen different figures on how many people were enslaved and also who perished as a result of Columbus and the people who came after him. Do you have a feel for that or information on that? And
What's a feel? There were no census takers in Native America, either
right.
north or
That's
south
why I
at
wonder
the
how.
time.
That was my next question. How did they come up with the figures?
Well, there are various means, primarily based upon the archaeological evidence having to do with the agricultural attainments of the people, the types of agriculture that were employed, and what climatic conditions and what crops were planted in these agricultural pursuits, the average yield over a span of time that could be expected, and how many people could be extrapolated from the acreage under cultivation and the yield per acre. There's a range of possible projections based on that. For North America, where the Smithsonian Institution still insists through its mouthpiece Time magazine that there were not more than 2 million people north of the Rio Grande, these kinds of methodologies employed by various cultural demographers have yielded a range of population from approximately 12.5 million to 18.5 million in 1492. Hemispherically, the figures now run, the current figures, anywhere from 100 million to 130 million. And the cost and consequence in terms of population of the Columbian arrival was about 90% reduction of that overall hemispheric population within the first century, which is, using the generational timetable for that period, about 5 generations. And it was sustained policy, sustained impact over that entire period. This was nothing like the 12-year Reich. This was a winning proposition that sustained its genocidal policies in effect, generation after generation after generation, and the attrition of native people correspondingly occurred in generation after generation after generation. This is a process really unparalleled in human history.
It is an awful record, and it all begins with Columbus and those processes that Columbus took from Europe and implanted there, first in the islands of the Caribbean, and then they were carried on to the mainlands, the 2 large continents behind those islands. But it is a long process of enslavement and slave labor and killing and death. It's just an awful record. If, as we now figure, there may have been 100 million Indians in the 2 continents of the New World, some people will figure that is 120, maybe 130 million. But I think the consensus now is hovering around 100 million. 95 or 97% of those died off in a century because of these European diseases and the dislocation of their society by these European invaders. Now that is, as you say, Holocaust. There's nothing like it in history of a death at that scale. And then that's followed by the disruption of African societies, and all in the name of the enslavement of Indians and of Africans. This is a terrible record for us to contemplate when we think about Columbus and the quincentenary.
I do not want to diminish the experience of the Jews, the Gypsies, Poles, Slavs, and so on at the hands of the Nazis. That's no point in doing that, and that's not the purpose. The point is to bring a Holocaust which has been suppressed from human memory, which is driven from history, which the existence of which is denied, back into public consciousness. It's not a matter of we're more oppressed than someone else. It's that both groups, or all the groups afflicted with this kind of a policy imposition, are oppressed, and horribly oppressed. And these are not things to celebrate, they are things to be understood so that the processes by which they occur can be ended conclusively, driven from the attitudinal complex of human psychology, so that people are not inclined either to commit them or to justify and rationalize them once they've been committed.
You know, in reading history, world history, and seeing what happened to the Native Americans, seeing what happened to the blacks who were brought over as slaves and everything, everywhere you look around the world, where there's the footprint of the white Christian male, it seems that just horrible things have taken place. What is there in the psychology of these people that caused this?
Ultimately, what we're talking about is something called European, and that's not precisely correlated with any given genetic code. It's a state of mind. Europe is not a geographical entity. It is not a continent. It is a parapeninsula sticking out of the Asian mainland. It's a geographical fabrication designed to conform to a cultural fabrication that was intended to be expansionist, intended to be consumptive, intended to express a dominating relationship to the natural order in all of its manifestations, including the human populations that could be construed as part of the natural order. Again, as an invention, the first thing that Europe had to do in order to create itself was colonize itself. And you can find that history from the point of the advent of the Holy Roman Empire, Charlemagne, and all that in Germany onward. And you have this long period of consolidation of various indigenous land-based, land-linked peoples within this geography that is now known as Europe by a centralized dominating ideological force, which ultimately becomes predominating in that area. And along about the time when Columbus begins to usher forth from Europe, you find a consolidation of that into something that's actually known and identifiable and recognizable as Europe.
Never before did Europe discover a place with so many people and so much treasure and so much of value. And this is little tiny Europe, which is a subcontinent of the Asian continent. And it came upon these two huge continents with immense treasure, immense resources. And it was because of those resources, and not just gold and silver, but the foodstuffs and the fish and the forests
the land.
And the medicines, and then ultimately the land on which to build colonies and agricultural systems. It was because of all of that treasure that Europe became Europe, that it was able to survive and prosper and build the institutions that make it into the thing that we see as Western civilization. But when in the process of doing that, you're right in saying it carried out those ideas that it had long harbored as a way to treat nature and other people, and the way to dominate and to conquer.
It's European mindset, predatory mindset, which is at issue. You got white people to this day. The Irish, for example, are decisively non-European, resistant to colonization by this force of Europe, this idea, this abstraction. The Basques continue to resist. The Frieslanders in northern Germany, and you can name a number of other peoples who are decisively, in their outlook, non-European, and yet they are white. By the same token, one of the byproducts of this global process of conquest and colonization that ushered forth in the name of Europe has resulted in a number of people of different skin tones adopting this precise same outlook, this precise same worldview. So I would argue you've got black, brown, red, yellow, and white Europeans, and you've got a lot of non-Europeans who happen to be white.
What kind of individuals could go over and conquer a paradise, simply taking possession of it, assuming it was theirs to claim, and then could subject the native populations to slavery, murder, and eventually a Holocaust? It's not just, as we pointed out, Columbus who's the villain in this scenario. He's a representative, rather, of a whole civilization, of a whole mindset, a whole philosophy, if you will.
It is a very complex and, of course, unpleasant discussion that leads us to. What kind of a civilization? A civilization which is at its bottom, I would suggest, in 1492. That is a desperate, miserable place of turmoil and chaos and violence that has lost its way, that has no institutions of either church or state to guide it. It's coming out of a medieval period, and all of the things that sustained it through this medieval period are evaporating. It's coming out of now a century and more, a century and a half of debilitating diseases that the Black Plague and others that keep recurring throughout Europe and killed off at least a third of the population there. And there's a mess, in fact. They are searching for some salvation in this continent, and they don't know where it is. There's a lot of messianic millenarian sects operating, which say that this is the end of the earth. Everything is so terrible it can't go on, and there must be salvation in God somehow. And if I believe in God, then the second coming will happen, and we will be taken up into heaven. But that was the limit of their idea of salvation. It was a desperate place, and Columbus is exactly of this time, and he too believed in the end of the earth and of the misery around, and a place of chaos and disorder and violence. Violence not merely of the Inquisition, which was awful throughout Spain, but violence everywhere in the rest of Europe. With the Borgias are famous for it, and the Scottish kings were killing each other, but wars of all kinds taking place. It was a desperate culture that had a sense that there was salvation and that they were looking for salvation. They thought that they would find that salvation over there. They never thought that they would find it here, learning how to live properly on the land. No, it had to be over there, and it probably had to be treasure. It had to be the amassment of material wealth as salvation. So Columbus comes from a culture like that, confronts a society where he says these people are so wonderful, and they are harmonious with each other, and they are living on a bountiful earth, and they are so good and kind and egalitarian and sweet and gentle. There was salvation right there. Salvation about how to live with one another, how to live on the earth without destroying it. These Indians had what we now think was the most productive agricultural system in the world at that time. And there was salvation there. Europe could have learned. If it had been Margaret Mead instead of Columbus who went out there, she might have said, oh, look at these people and look at their nice sexual habits and look at the way they're kind to each other. I'll write that down and I'll take that back to Europe and I'll say, Europe, here's a way that we can learn to live with each other and live on the land. But of course it couldn't have been Margaret Mead in 1492. It just had to be Columbus.
Well, there's also the opposite of what was being taught with the church domination and all the horrible things which religion and the church foisted upon the people about how to live and retribution and these types of things. So they naturally would have rejected something like that over there, I would think.
Well, the church has a lot to answer for. That's true. And the church, which begins with the teaching at the very core of humans' right to have dominion over the other species and their ecosystems and do anything they want for human betterment. But actually the church is in real disarray and collapse at this point, and corruption and violence within the church. And it's just a few years from now that Luther begins the Reformation to complete the real disintegration of the Catholic Church. So I'm not sure that there is that strong a feeling in the practices and beliefs of the church. I think it rather locates in the beliefs of humanism, which is beginning to arise now with the Renaissance and with the recovery of the ancients and the wisdom of the ancients, which reaffirms for Europe a humanism which says that there's a chain of being with God and the angels and man, and then woman and children, and then the beasts. And man is given the earth to do whatever he wants to on that earth. And it doesn't matter because he is godlike and noble and can do whatever he wants. With that kind of an attitude, or at least coupling that with the Christian attitude, you could then see why Columbus will go out, and once he finds all of these marvelous treasures and marvelous bountiful lands, will just go and take and destroy. And he does destroy. He does destroy that island that he is on, of which he is the governor. He destroys that very quickly, probably within the tenure, in the 7 years that he is governor there, we can see the old growth forest gone forever, and the rivers beginning to silt up, and the soils eroding, and the whole thing is destroyed by 1518, when we have an official report going back to the King of Spain. The report says this was once a bountiful, beautiful land, and it is now a desert.
What sort of things did they do to so violently disrupt nature?
This is a culture that is very good at destruction. Europe has practiced destruction for a long time, and in the 15th century was developing the institutions and the technology of destruction, and the ideology that permitted this kind of destruction as well. The form that it took was the implantation of the ranchero system out of Spain, which was the same thing that eventually went to the Argentine Pampas and to the Old West of the United States. But it begins in Spain, and then its first location is on this island of Hispaniola. Columbus brings over in 1493 horses and cattle and sheep and pigs, and these are all new things in the New World, nothing like that ever before, and they have no predators, and they have no diseases, and so they just run roughshod over the island. And the Spanish cut down the forests to give them space, but they go beyond that space, and they go into the savannas. In fact, they multiply so rapidly the Spanish can't even keep control of them, and wild horses are found there as early as 1498. This is just a few years after they're brought over. And the pigs are so numerous that they are called infinitos in Spanish. And these animals and the red meat system that Columbus and the Spanish impose on that island just destroy the bountiful and lush greenery that was once there. And of course, the Europeans didn't understand then, and indeed many to this day don't understand, that when you have a tropical forest, as you would have had on that island, the wealth of that tropical forest is in the canopy, not in the soil. In Europe, all the wealth is in the soils, but what happens when you destroy the canopy, when you cut down the trees, the soil is thin and there's nothing there. All of the virtue, the strength and the wealth of that system has been destroyed. And you open up the soils, and in a few years they are eroded and gone. And this is what the Spanish did there. And they turned that island into a desert within the space of a generation.
That is clearly within the definition of ecocide. You find the roots to that, I think, perhaps scripturally in Christian doctrine, with the notion that man is created in the image of God, thereby rendering man godlike on earth and exercising, therefore, prerogatives of God, which is to transform, to create something new from that which was not. In other words, to take nature and transform it into something else. That goes under the rubric of production and development. And the extent to which you're able to rearrange nature at whim to serve human-defined needs, correct or incorrect, is the extent to which you can measure something called progress.
You would do whatever you could in service of the ideology that said that material wealth was to be wrested from the earth as rapidly and swiftly, as violently as possible. And so if you would use strip mining some places, and you would enslave the Indians if you could keep them alive to go down into deep mining. It didn't matter. You'd use any techniques you could. And the United States, in its formation, was simply perfecting this ideology and the processes that go along with it. And although we did not make a desert of the entire North American continent, we have made a desert of much of it, and we are continuing to make a desert. We're continuing to lose topsoil even now and to poison the rest of it in this same headless and headlong pursuit of the destruction and use of nature any way we can do it. De Tocqueville talks in 1830, savvy kind of French observer of this scene. 1830, he says the Americans are insensitive to this wilderness that is around them. And this is just when the new nation is beginning to push farther and farther west. He says they don't see the wilderness there except at the point of the axe, where they are cutting it down. And they are hell-bent on going across this continent, a continent which at that time they didn't even know how big it was, in fact. They're going across this continent, cutting down the forests, damming up the rivers, filling in the swamps, and subduing nature. Well, we started doing it in 1492. We were still doing it in 1830. And we are still doing it in 1992, and we've simply gotten better and better and better at it. Our institutions and our technologies and our ideologies all direct us in the same way that says that this is right and good and proper, and that whatever we can accumulate in this is fine. Well, except we now know it's not fine. We can't go on this way.
In North America, the area north of Rio Grande, we were talking about the demography of that, the 12.5 to 18.5 odd million people who were here in 1500 had, by U.S. Census count in 1890, been reduced to 237,000, which is about a 99th percentile reduction over the intervening period of time. It's not coincidental in my mind that in that same year, 1890, when they conducted the census, the U.S. Department of Interior reports that U.S. Indian land has been reduced through allotment and the various forms of cession that were imposed upon Native people to about 50 million acres, which is approximately 2.5% of the original Aboriginal holdings within the 48 contiguous states of the United States. Now, you've got a 98 to 99 percentile reduction in population and a 97.5 percentile reduction in land base. These two fit together with near perfection. And as I say, it's not coincidental. You cannot separate the process of consuming population from the process of consuming the land. Then ultimately you convert from the acquisition of the raw acreage of the land into the utilization of the resources of the land. It's not an abrupt departure. They didn't wait until the conquest was complete before they began it. Richard Drennan, for example, in Facing West, has this very beautiful set of passages where he is talking about the Pilgrim Fathers cutting down Indians as they marched from east to west, and as they cut down the Indians, they correspondingly cut down 10 trees every time they cut down an Indian, okay, and that relationship is perfect. So the process had already been underway. It's a sort of a staggered startup. But those two pieces go together, and they continue to. They continue to. You have the consumption of native populations. The average life expectancy of an American Indian reservation-based male right now today is 44.6 years, okay? It's by a dramatic margin for an overall population group, the lowest in North America. And corresponding to that, you have the exercise of trust control over Indian resources by the federal government on Indian land. And the upshot of that is that the benefits that accrue from the utilization of these resources accrue to the dominant society corporations and the government itself, to the benefit of the dominating or colonizing society, not to the people who at least nominally owned the resources, leaving them, although it's a vast wealth pouring from their land, absolutely destitute, and the short life expectancy is one of the upshots of that, having to do with highest rate of death from plague disease and exposure and malnutrition. I'm talking bubonic plague here too, still incidences of that on native reservations. Highest rate of infant mortality, highest rate of teen suicide, and so on and so on. These are indices of dire poverty on a land base, which on per capita basis is the largest of any group in the United States and endowed with the greatest, quantitatively speaking, mineral resource deposits of any portion of the land base of North America. Indians should be the wealthiest population sector in North America. They are instead the poorest. Okay, that consumption of life and the consumption of resources, the patterns of the consumption are still integrally related. They cannot be separated. We have a colonial construct in the United States. We have an archipelago of internal colonies in the United States. Every time you see an Indian reservation or see it demarcated on a map, you are looking at a de facto colony, literally. It's a colonial order.
So
That's the thing that people aren't talking about when they're talking about Columbus. They talk about the genocide and slavery and all of the horrible things that resulted from Columbus and his the people that came over after him. But you don't hear them talking much about the same thing is still occurring today, like you were saying. They're still clearing the land and moving the people, the Native Americans, off of the land in order to exploit it. They're slaughtering Indians still in Guatemala to clear the land so that they can exploit it. Not a heck of a lot has changed, has it? Except maybe the great expanse of it.
No, other than technologically, perhaps in Guatemala, which is a literal example, or Paraguay, where they were taking out the Ache Indians, actually with technology comparable to that employed by the conquistadores. They were using machetes because bullets were too expensive to kill these people. In those areas, it's quite literal continuation of the process. In the United States, the process also goes on, and that's what upsets us. It's not the fact that we are upset so much by what happened 500 years ago, although we clearly disagree with that. It's the fact that it established a certain process or dynamic that is ongoing to the present time. In the United States, for example, the Genocide Convention, the 1948 Convention on Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, was not ratified by the United States Congress for 40 years after its passage and adoption by more than 100 civilized nations around the world. A primary reason, perhaps not the only one, but a primary reason is that policies, official federal policies that were ongoing at the time, were continued in force against American Indians right up into the 1980s and to a certain extent continue today. For example, under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, the compulsory or forced transfer of the children of a given group, a targeted ethnic or racial group, to another group, the dominating group, is considered to be part and parcel of crime and genocide. The United States government maintained, in effect, right up into the late 1980s, a boarding school system in which children were mandatorily taken from their homes, banished for years on end to institutions remote from the localities from which they came, remote from their cultures, where they were prohibited from practicing their religion, prohibited from speaking their language, compelled to adapt dress codes and haircutting codes and so forth that were antithetical to their own traditions. They were then inculcated or indoctrinated with the ideology of white values and so forth, and the idea was to bring about their eventual assimilation of their people. In less polite language, that means dissolution of their people, disappearance of their people as such, so that the individual members may survive, but the people as such will be gone, an historical artifact. Well, that's precisely the definition of genocide. That objective is genocidal insofar as we understand genocide not to be mass murder, and Lemkin and the other jurists who coined the term were quite clear about that. Mass murder is one means by which to accomplish it, but there are numerous other means, and the objective of genocide as such is to bring about the disappearance of human groups so they no longer exist. That's one. Prevention of births within a group is another. During the 1970s, 1972 through 76, in a secret program administered by the Indian Health Service in the United States during the period when it was still lodged under the Bureau of Indian Affairs, approximately 42% of all Native women of childbearing age were involuntarily sterilized. This is genocide. You can kind of understand, given the policy realities involved, why the Senate would be a little bit hesitant to ratify a convention declaring this to be a capital offense, perpetration of genocide.
What you've been doing this year to protest the Columbus quincentennial celebrations?
Well, I'm from Colorado AIM. That's the AIM chapter that I'm involved with. I've been involved with the activities of other groups around the country as well. But in Denver, Colorado, our response to Columbus Day was simply to put an end to it. The Federation of Italian American Organizations declined to proceed under any rubric other than Columbus. The idea was floated that maybe since they kept insisting that they did not wish to celebrate our genocide, they intended no insult to us, etc., 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 but rather that they wished to celebrate their attainments, their cultural achievements, as one of their leaders put it, our wine, our women, and our song, okay? And we having no objection to that if that's what they want to do. The idea was floated that they might want to call it, instead of Columbus Day, Italian American Appreciation Day, and that we would come down en masse and join the celebration. They declined to do that, insisted upon Columbus. The upshot of that was on the 10th of October, when they had declared they would have a massive outpouring of sentiment from the Italian-American community to put us in our place, which apparently was an acquiescence to their celebration of genocide. They had 100 people. We had 3,000 odd. They sent emissaries over from the U.S. Department of Justice to ask us if they canceled their parade at the last minute, if we would grant them safe passage out of the area, okay? Which is the appropriate relationship in this particular instance, in my view. We, of course, granted them safe passage. They tried to pretend they had a parade on the way out the 2 blocks to the Capitol building, duplicitous to the very end. But ultimately, they were crushed, and everyone knew it. That's Denver. There was a tribunal held with regard to Columbus and the Columbian legacy and the activities of nation-state governments that have accrued from the Columbian legacy in the present period. It was conducted in San Francisco earlier in October. I participated in that. I know the day after we had our demonstration, our victory, whatever you want to call it, in Denver, there was a mass demonstration in San Francisco which prevented a symbolic landing of 3 boats representing Columbus and his crew. That did not occur because there were so many people opposed to it on the beach that they couldn't find a place to land. There was a rather sharp confrontation with regard to the Italian community's parade conducted in the North Beach sector of San Francisco. I know that there were demonstrations in New York, Corpus Christi, Washington, D.C., Columbus, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Syracuse, and a number of other locations around the country. That's inside the United States. In Genoa, Italy, Columbus's alleged birthplace, 20,000 odd people came out to protest any further celebration of what it was that he had wrought upon the world.
That's remarkable.
Yeah, in the capital city of the island that was formerly known as Espanola, Columbus's major colony, they dumped a statue of him in the bay and had essentially street altercations with the police that resulted in 2 people dead as the state government attempted to fulfill a commitment that it made to the government of Spain to celebrate. And the population was having no part of it. So you had a very intense struggle occurred there. There were demonstrations throughout the Caribbean and in at least 20 major cities throughout South America. In Central America, I understand there were some too, but I'm not sure of the extent. So you have an inter-hemispheric response, negative response to Columbus. I know that there were things that happened in Valladolid, in Madrid, in Castile, in Spain, and we could go on. So that response is a very clear one.
This is a turning point, actually, it seems to me, in response to Columbus, who had previously been celebrated. It seems the facts really have gotten out.
Well, people have come to understand in ever clearer fashion the nature of the actual consequences that derive from the mindset that he brought, and the mindset that, in a way, intentionally or not, that he galvanized, that he crystallized into a form that it would become the predominating dynamic guiding the world for the next 500 years. And we are all suffering as a result of that, to varying degrees, to be sure, but there's virtually no one who's not suffering the consequences of what Columbus begot. And most people at this point, even if they're not actively demonstrating opposition or choosing not to celebrate this, for one reason or another, at least to stand on the sideline and say, well, I'm not going to go out there and confront. But on the other hand, I'm not going to participate in the celebration either. I'm not that comfortable with it anymore. And I find that to be a very significant shift in consciousness.
Ward, let's turn to some other struggles that the American Indian movement is involved in. Why don't you run through some of the actions you're involved in, and then we'll focus on the ones that you think are most significant to discuss with us today.
Well, there are a number of actions in which the American Indian movement as a whole, and that's a multiplicity of different local organizations, actually. Some of the things that aim people either as self-identifying members of the American Indian movement or as groups going by other names that follow and subscribe to essentially the same principles the American movement are involved in, have to do with the sovereignty struggle of the Mohawk people on both sides of the Canadian border, upstate New York and around Montreal, have to do with the land claim struggle, the land recovery struggle in upstate Minnesota, around White Earth and Red Lake reservations in particular, have to do with fishing rights under various treaties in Wisconsin, to a certain extent still in the Northwest, Oregon, Washington, Idaho area, have to do with the Black Hills land claim struggle, have to do with opposition to renewal of uranium mining on Indian land, have to do with trying to enforce standards of cleanup for uranium mining and milling that's already occurred, have to do with opposition to the forced relocation of the largest remaining enclave of traditional Indians within at least the 48 contiguous states of the United States, and possibly Alaska as well, possibly the largest in the U.S. At Big Mountain in Arizona, a measure that was undertaken by the government as a matter of policy in order to open the way for Peabody Coal Corporation to mine low sulfur coal that was easily accessible and therefore profitable. Has to do with the truncation of jurisdictional prerogatives and national integrity of the O'odham, or Papago Nation, down along the Arizona-Mexico border. A portion of their traditional territory is in Arizona and a portion's across the line in Mexico. Opposition to the administration, the dispensation of hepatitis A vaccine at this point, test battery that's being undertaken on Northern Plains Indian reservations to find out what the effects of this stuff will be. They've already run a program in which they administered hepatitis B vaccine to Inuit children in Alaska. Now, this sounds like a very strange thing, perhaps, to some people that we would be upset about. But you have to understand about hepatitis B is that it was being field tested in Africa during the late 1970s, early 1980s. The World Health Organization ultimately banned it for global distribution based on the fact that it was correlated to HIV. Okay, a certain amount of the vaccine was contaminated. They weren't exactly sure how this had occurred, but that it produced HIV response in certain of the children, a noticeable group of the children, in fact, who were inoculated with it. So they banned it. The United States pharmaceutical corporations had a fair supply that had already been manufactured. It was on hand, so it was administered through Indian Health Service to Inuit kids in North Slope of Alaska. Okay, and we say categorically that this is a genocidal activity too. You do not inoculate people with something that's going to lead to AIDS on a widespread basis in the midst of an AIDS epidemic, or otherwise for that matter. That they're just saying that the relatively minor amount of expense that would have been involved in simply destroying the vaccine was not something acceptable to the corporations or to the government, for that matter. And so they cut their losses by selling the stuff at a cut rate to the government for dispensation to Native children, because they are only Native children, out of sight, out of mind, and not particularly valued by the society anyway. If they did that, no one would really yell, because it was only Indians, mere gooks, as they used to say in Vietnam, okay?
And have you been able to stop this program, or?
Well, apparently they ran out of hepatitis B, so they're now field testing hepatitis A, which the World Health Organization has arrived at a tentative conclusion that there's a correlation with that and HIV as well. Okay, well, I guess they want to find out before they administer it to the general population, so they're field testing it on Indians.
So you're guinea pigs, basically.
Basically. And then the consequences of an entire generation for some of the indigenous nations involved that are likely to be AIDS contaminated, or AIDS infected. Now that, again, as I say, is genocide. And it's part and parcel of the Columbian legacy. It can only be done based on the attitudes that were imported with Columbus and that have been maintained through celebration and revision of the history of the man ever since. Absent the attitudes that come with a celebratory mentality that says that genocide is something we should applaud, people will, as a rule, oppose these things, but they're conditioned not to. They're conditioned not to at all.
It's tragic. Right. Because it is a tragedy in that sense, that Shakespearean sense, that Europe had to do what it did. It had to seek salvation elsewhere, and it had to settle, and it had to destroy, and it had to do so with the most advanced technologies of destruction at its command, and it had to ignore the wisdom of the other people that they saw there. That's half of the tragedy. The other half of the tragedy is that the Indians had to welcome these people in. Now, you could imagine that all those Indians on the island of Hispaniola might have just taken the 90 sailors on these 3 small ships and pushed them off into the ocean or drowned them or whatever. But they weren't that kind of people at all. They were a giving, loving people. Their whole economy depended upon circular giving. And instead of being acquisitive people that the Europeans understood, they were quite the opposite, and they were always friendly, and they always welcomed these people, at least at the start, until they realized what the consequences would be. But they had to be that way. So the tragedy is that both societies had to do what they had to do.
It was a Greek tragedy. There were 2 unreconcilable forces that met.
Yes.
Each of which had their logic, their culture, and they just clashed.
And
they couldn't harmonize.
And we are living out the terrible, tragic results of that clash.